want to introduce our new speaker for today. His name is Mr. Jason Moon, and he preaches for the Roebuck Parkway Church of Christ. He's new to the area around here, and so we happy to have him here, and we hope we can get him to speak a little bit more often for us here at Chump. They've been getting settled down in the new house and stuff, so I've been trying to give him a little time to get settled in, so hopefully we can get him a little bit more often now, so I'll let him come at this time.
I had planned to talk to you today about the meanest man in the Bible. You know who the meanest man in the Bible was? Who? Nebuchadnezzar? Okay, pretty mean. I was kind of thinking about Moses. You know why Moses was the meanest man in the Bible? He broke all 10 commandments at one time. Think about that for just a minute. And then I thought, well, okay, you know, that's kind of a joke. But then I thought, you know, who was maybe really the meanest man in the Bible, other than Nebuchadnezzar, maybe? I thought about David. David, because, I mean, quite literally, he broke 5 of the 10 commandments during one episode of his life. But then I hear that Coach O'Connor already talked about David. So I decided I would talk to you, instead of about the meanest man in the Bible, I want to talk just a couple of minutes about the leanest man in the Bible. The leanest man in the Bible just might have been the prophet Elijah. Because there is an episode in his life when he runs literally 20 miles ahead of a chariot. He's not just, you know, a slow jog. He's running fast in front of a chariot. He must have been a pretty skinny guy if he could do that. There's another episode in his life when he runs from God again. And so what about this leanest man in the Bible can we learn? Well, I'll tell you, we can learn how to overcome some mistakes. There are 3 things that, you know, really describe Elijah. You might say that at one point in his life, Elijah was a champion, and then he went from being a champion to a chump, and then he went from being a chump to riding in a chariot. Because you know how his story ends. You've been told that story. You've studied it. He gets to ride into heaven in a chariot of fire at the end of his life. But look at this transition, though. He goes from being a champion to a chump to riding in a chariot. And here's how it unfolds. He's a champion when we first read about him in 1 Kings chapter 17 and 18. There are 10 things he does, and we don't have the time to go through all 10 of those things that he does that causes him to be a spiritual champion, like we all want to be. But among some of those things he did, he prayed. He prayed that it wouldn't rain for a long time, and God heard his prayer. He raised a dead person in 1 Kings chapter 17. And then in chapter 18, he defeats false doctrine, and he actually puts to death the false prophets of Baal. And so at this point, he is a spiritual champion. But then all of a sudden, we find him becoming a chump. He's a champion, and he's like on the mountaintop. And then he becomes a chump, and he's down in the valley. He was a hero when he was defeating the false prophets of Baal. And all of a sudden, when we get to chapter 19, he's a zero. I mean, how do you go from being on the mountaintop to the valley, from being a hero to a zero, from being a champion to a chump, almost overnight? Well, I'll tell you what he did. He did 3 things that caused that. Number 1, he listened to the enemies. That's the first thing he did that caused him to go from being a champion to a chump. He listened to the enemies. Number 2, he ran away from God. Now, in chapter 18, or chapter 17 rather, he's running for God. And you get to chapter 19, he's running from God. And so he makes this major change in his life. And then the third thing is he gave up serving. He gave up serving God, and he gave up serving his people. That's what caused him to go from being a champion to a chump. But we know how the story ends. The story ends when he gets to ride on the chariot. So what did he do to change it? What did he do to overcome the mistakes that he made? The first thing he did is he turned back to God. He allowed God to nourish him and satisfy him once again. Literally, God fed him a couple of times when we get to chapter 19. The second thing he did is he confessed his faith in God again. He confessed that he knew God, and then he needed God. He started talking to God. He started praying to God again. He had a religious experience, we might say, with God again in chapter 19. And then the third thing he did is he started serving again. Because at the end, when he became a chump, he quit serving. And when he wanted to get ready to ride on that chariot to heaven, he started to serve again. And so I want to remind you that this story is there for our learning. I hope that you're a spiritual champion right now. Keep on being that. But there's going to become a point in your life, more than likely, where you're going to go down in the valley. You're going to feel like a hero one day, and you're going to all of a sudden say, now I'm a zero. You're going to feel like you go from being a champion to a chump, but that's not the end. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story can be much like with Elijah. You can go into heaven. You're not going to ride on a chariot of fire like him. That was a special case. But you can still become a person who will experience what God wants for you, and that is to go to heaven. When you turn back to Him, you rely on God, you talk to God, and you serve people. And I hope that's just a little lesson that will help you become the spiritual champion you want to be and remain the spiritual champion that God wants you to be. Thank you for having me today. Appreciate it.